Hi, everybody. I'm really excited about our webinar today. We're talking about salt, and we have two great speakers. If you don't know me, I'm Emily Bialowis. I'm both the Chesapeake Monitoring Coordinator at the Isaac Walton League, and I have also taken the Winter Salt Watch program under my wing. A couple of housekeeping things about how this webinar is going to go. We're going from now until 1. We have 2 speakers, and you can put questions in the chat, but I think we're going to hold, there's a question box where you will write your question. But we're going to have a question answer session at the end after both speakers have spoken. This will be recorded, so if you didn't get to watch the whole thing, or if you want to share it with folks, you should be able to do that. So I'm going to get started, and then I'm going to introduce our next speakers. So I want to tell you a little bit about Winter Salt Watch, because this is the kickoff for Salt Watch. So it started with a pile of salt in front of our office, and one of our interns got really upset about that, because it was sitting right on a storm drain. And long story short, Salt Watch was born. What is the goal of Salt Watch? We want to raise awareness in the general public about that connection between the salt on the road and stream health. And we want to identify chloride hotspots in fresh water. So that's in streams, and now we're expanding to lakes. And this year, we're really working to encourage our volunteers to advocate for smarter application of road salt, both by sharing those results that they find from Salt Watch, and sharing smart salting techniques, some of which we're going to talk about today, but we will also have some resources on our website. So this is what you get in a Salt Watch kit. This is actually a little bit dated, but you get this card that shows you what your strip is saying. You get 4 test strips that you can use to test for chloride in your streams, and you get another card that explains how to upload your data to Water Reporter. So you should monitor before a winter storm, also before any winter storms, to get that baseline reading so you know what you're comparing it against. After salt has been applied to roads, and after the first warm day or rainstorm following a snow or freeze. So we're just looking for some of those higher levels of salt spiking in the streams. This is an example of a great submission on Water Reporter. You can really clearly see the strip. There's a clear white peak on the strip, and the water has gone all the way up to turn the color of this top thread dark, and you can read it here. This is 3.6 quantabs, and that is 132 parts per million chloride, which is kind of high. And we can see the whole card, and you can write a comment here about when and how you took your reading and what the circumstances were. So this is the outcome. Last year, we sent out over 1,000 kits, and we got 770 reports back. This year, we're really amping that up. We have about 4,000 kits to send out. So if you haven't requested yours yet, you can request that. So after you take your Salt Watch reading, what can you do? If you find high levels of chloride, you should let someone know. You can report any high levels to your local watershed entity, so your Soil and Water Conservation District, your local watershed group that perhaps you're a part of. You can call your city or county Department of Environmental Protection to report high chloride levels or large salt piles you might see in parking lots or on the road. You can write a letter to the editor to your newspaper or send a letter to your local or state government, and you can share best practices with your community. They're not all posted yet, but we will have resources for all of this on our website up in the next week. This is our Salt Watch website, and you can order a kit there now, and you can also find a lot more information. And if you have more questions, you can email saltwatch@iwla.org. And now I'm going to switch over to our first presenter. So Gary Johnson is a retired professor from University of Minnesota. He's a forestry professor, and he is going to tell us all about the impact of chlorides and road salt on trees. So, Gary, are you ready to go?
I sure hope I am. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to talk, I tend to be a little bit flippant about things, but I acknowledge that the problem is a lot more than people just not wanting to slow down in the winter. It's also people not wanting to fall and break their hips, or businesses not wanting to get sued, or freshwater advocates not wanting to drink toxic water. But a lot of the problem is that people are looking for a magic bullet that is going to take away all the risks. And I hope today, when we get through our few minutes together, we'll see that whoops, something just happened to. Let's try it again.
You still have control of the mouse, Gary?
No, my screen just went blank.
Oh.
Just little things. So actually, I hate to waste time. So
no, that's okay. We could.
If you wouldn't mind, I'll just tell you to click, and I know these slides so well now.
Okay, I can click, sure.
Great. So click to the second frame. So in this short amount of time that we're going to be together, we're only going to be covering the basics. For instance, we're going to quickly discuss how sodium and chloride ions affect tree health, either by direct toxicity or by altering water uptake potential by the roots, or just by messing up soil chemistry and structure. We're also going to spend a minute or two discussing how all salts degrade the health of living soil. And I tend to kind of dwell a little bit more on the living soil than anything else, because that's the longest term damage that salt does. And when I talk about living soil, I'm talking about the bacteria, the fungi, nematodes, arthropods, all the living organisms that build soil for us and keep soil healthy, and then keep the plants healthy too. So if we could go to the third frame now. So the third frame, it's just part one. We're gonna look at what are the effects of salt on tree health. Fourth frame. All right, first of all, chloride kills. And chloride kills roots, it kills foliage when it gets taken up by the plant. Notice that I'm saying chloride, not just sodium chloride, but chloride. So when chloride is overused or accumulates, it is toxic to roots, but more importantly, it's also toxic to foliage. So when it builds up to higher levels in the foliage, then you start seeing browning and death of the foliage and death of the buds too. Both ions are actually very toxic once they accumulate to certain levels. And for instance, in this scene here, I'm not going to dwell on the trees in the frame to the right. I'm looking strictly at the vegetation. You can tell where the snow from the parking lot, snow and the ice that had de-icing salt in it to melt it down so people could travel safely, walk safely, was pushed off over the curb into the turf. And you can also see where, as the snow melted and the ice melted and went down slope, it killed everything. Now, this is a really good indication of what chloride can do in the soil in terms of killing the roots. That grass is not going to come back. And so every year in this particular situation, they have to come in, rip out the dead sod, bring in fresh soil, reseed the area, and start all over again until the next year. It's kind of frustrating. All right, the next frame. So how does salt kill? Again, continuing on this, the thing about turf grass is we can replace it, just like I just explained, but it's a different story with trees. Trees take a long time to react, they take a long time to be replaced too. So when we have this, for instance, the water balance in the soil, the normal water balance in the soil can be upset when there's this accumulation of these salts, these ions in the soil, to the point where, especially with a clay soil, water can start moving from the plant roots into the soil because of this water imbalance. And just, to demonstrate, and I'm going to assume that most of you already know this, but if you're not familiar with this, one of the simplest little experiments you can do when you go home today and you have more time than you know what to do with is just take a tall glass of water and put a carrot in it, put some water in there, and put about a tablespoon or two of table salt in it, and then come back in a couple hours. And what you're going to find is that carrot is limp. And what has happened is that the salt concentration in the ambient water is actually pulled moisture from the carrot, and dump the water out, put in pure fresh water, and the carrot rehydrates. So it's a little bit of an example of what actually happens to tree roots. Why am I telling you this? Because one of the symptoms is scorch, as you can see in this picture. And scorch is normally associated with drought, not enough water. You can have a soil that seems like it has plenty of moisture, and still the symptoms of the plant are looking like drought stress. Next frame, please. Excuse me. So just looking at, what type of damage that the salt does, chloride ion is most toxic to tree roots. So I get real nervous when I see trees in drainage ditches or in low areas, because I know chloride is accumulating in there, and I know that there's going to be a lot of root death. It also causes this water imbalance we talked about, resulting in scorch-like symptoms. Along with that, we start getting these water-related stresses. And probably one of the more common water-related stresses would be the opportunistic wood-boring insects. Two-line chestnut borer goes for oaks, and in particular goes for oaks that are water stressed. Bronze birch borer goes for birches, in particular birches that are water stressed. So this artificial water stress situation can lead to a lot of other secondary problems or contributing problems that eventually kill the plants. Above ground growth becomes retarded because of nutrient deficiencies. These ions, the sodium and the chloride ions, start replacing the normal mineral ions in the soil that would normally support good, healthy plants. And now you start seeing nutrient deficiencies, which is really weird, because if you do a soil test, the soil test will say, oh no, there's plenty of magnesium, or there's plenty of manganese in there. Over time, the soil becomes more alkaline. And for a lot of plants, that's no big deal. If you have basswoods, if you have bur oaks, it's no big deal. They're very, very tolerant of acidic, neutral, and very alkaline soils. But when you have soils or plants that are teetering on the edge, that it doesn't take much to tip them from 7.0 to 7.2. And for instance, river birch, really tough plant, you hit 7.2 and it starts turning yellow, becoming chlorotic, and this long, slow decline in health starts. And also soil structure starts to break down. Not such a big problem if you have a sandy soil or a sandy loam soil, big problem if you have a clay soil. And as the soil structure breaks down, becomes more compacted, then you have, a host of other issues that start performing here. Next slide, please. So here's some examples. If you look at the tree to the left, this is one of the Freeman maples. A lot of Freeman maples, and this one happens to be October Glory. And most of the time with October Glory, you relate this to a beautifully red tree in the autumn, not something that looks this puny and sickly in the middle of the summer. This is the result of alkalinity. And Alkalinity can be a result of natural, parent soils, can be a result of over fertilizing, but today we're talking about the overuse of de-icing salts. To the right is amber maple. And for all of you that thought there is nothing in the world that bothered amber maples, you were wrong. They eventually can succumb to the overuse of de-icing salts, become chlorotic, and then become more susceptible to other problems. Next frame, please. I think one of the symptoms that a lot of people are familiar with is this condition called witch's brooming. So sodium in particular can disfigure the above ground parts of plants. And so with deciduous plants, those trees that lose their leaves in the winter, the common symptom is witch's brooming. Witch's brooming does not kill a tree. It just makes you wish the tree was dead sometimes. Yeah, they end up looking like chia trees. But this bushy appearance is because the internodal length is retarded on these trees. And so you have lots of shoots coming out from the nodes, and it gives it this kind of bushy appearance. Next frame, please. With sodium and conifers, it's a little bit different. You don't see the witch's brooming on conifers, but you see dead foliage. And dead foliage, to me, it's not that big of a deal. It's kind of like witch's brooming. Health-wise, it's not a huge effect as long as the buds stay alive. When the sodium accumulation builds up in the buds and kills the buds, and you start losing the potential of the plant regenerating new needles, then you have a real health problem. But the big thing about this browning of conifers is they just look ugly, and nobody wants an ugly pine in their landscape. So that then starts leading to other problems. So is there anything else? Next frame. Of course there is. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had this frame in here. So we're going to go to the next frame. And this is the soil food web. So all you soil geeks out there, and I count myself as a soil geek, yeah, I can feel your pulse picking up on this one too. This is the unseen damage. When we see the scorching, the witch's brooming, the dieback above ground, that's pretty obvious. What we don't see is the shift in the microbial species. Notice I didn't say population. The population is still up there, but it's the different species, the species that were normally associated with the plants that normally were growing there, previously have been growing there, healthily have been growing there. And now it's booting out some. Microorganisms are wicked sensitive to changes in soil pH and especially soil pH, but also oxygen diffusion rate. So if you have a clay soil and it starts breaking down more from the overuse of salts and the accumulation of chlorides, you start getting different microorganisms that may not be so healthy, so beneficial to the plants. Next frame, please. So this is just a boring list of all the different microorganisms. This is not even all of them. This is just a partial one. And I would like to focus a little bit on the fungi. So if we could go to the next frame, the soil fungi are incredibly important. With bacteria and fungi and nematodes, et cetera, they break arthropods, they break down the organic matter or the leaf litter, the duff layer, et cetera, and release a lot of the nutrients. They also build up the cation exchange capacity. But fungi, in particular mycorrhizal fungi, are the associations with woody plants that are absolutely essential. They are not like, oh yeah, it's kind of nice if they have them, or some of the trees and shrubs have them. It's like, no, this is the norm. They have mycorrhizal root systems, mycorrhizal associations that make it much more able for the trees and the shrubs, and a lot of the perennials too, most of the perennials too, to absorb available moisture, to absorb available elements, because the hyphal structure of the fungi reaches, it mines so far out in the soil that these plants are really essentially dependent upon these soil fungi. And if they lose them, then they start this decline. And as I mentioned earlier, trees and shrubs are not grass that decline and die real fast, and then you can replace them easily. The decline process with trees and shrubs is long and slow, and a lot of people miss the early clues. So next slide, please. look up mycorrhizal fungi if you're not really familiar with it. A lot of my research has been about mycorrhizal, and they're fascinating fungi, and it's a fascinating study too. But the bottom line is plants require them, salt kills them or displaces them with other type of fungi that are not the normal mycorrhizal associates with these plants. All right, next frame. Bottom line, what can we do about this? I think that's where everything gets, important to us. The research and everything is wonderful, but we get down, what can we do about it? So we'll go to the next frame. We're going to look very quickly at 4 techniques. We're going to look at salt-tolerant species very quickly, the damage zone, physical protection, and then maybe some alternative products scenarios. If we could go to the next frame, please. So salt-tolerant species. One thing I want to mention on this is if you rely on salt-tolerant species, tree species, shrub species, vegetative, herbaceous species to solve all your problems, you're going to lose. You will lose. This is only part of the toolbox. And one of the things I want you to notice, but if you look at these tree species here, serviceberry, small tree, Russian olive, invasive, Japanese tree lilac, small and invasive, black locust. We do have some salt tough trees and shrubs, but a lot of times they're invasive. We don't want that. And a lot of times they're small. And being an urban forester, small trees are kind of pretty to me, and that's about it. They don't provide canopy. I want canopy. That's what helps people. Next frame, please. This is some of the research that was done at the University of Minnesota, horticultural science, and looking at, if you look at the graphic to the right, you can look at when you go from week 1 down to week 15, they progressively added more and more salt. And what you're going to see in here, the only grasses that kind of held their own, stayed alive and actually functioned were the tall fescues and the perennial ryegrasses. There are some other herbaceous species too listed, as you can see there, but again, don't rely on this to solve the problems. Next frame, please. So this is just a frame that gives you, some pretty good references for salt-tolerant species. I really like Virginia Tech's. In my opinion, the best one on the market is Purdue Extension. And that's a tough pill to swallow from the University of Minnesota recommending a different Big Ten school. All right, next frame. 60-foot damage zone. Most of the damage, and this is going to be primarily for the drift, the salt that gets mixed in with the melted snow and the ice, and then people driving down the highways at greater than 45 miles per hour. And if you have roads that are more than 10,000 vehicles per day, that's a lot of vehicles, you're going to get a lot more drift, and the prevailing winds are going to take it off. And 30 to 60 feet is the real big kill zone. Having said that, we have documented damage as far away as 500, 600, 700 feet. In the Chicago area, as far as 900 feet away, depending on prevailing winds and interstate highways. That's where you're going to see the majority of the damage, though, on the foliage loss. If you have a ditch, that's where salts are going to accumulate in a ditch. Next frame, please. So we get to physical protection. Physical protection works, but I don't know about you. Burlap is a very fine product, plywood, snow fencing and everything. I don't want to look at this. In Minnesota, I don't want to look at this for 5 months of the year or 6 months of the year. It seems like sometimes. Physical protection works, but it's one of those, it works against spray salt. It does not work against salt accumulation in the soil. And it's just, I'm sorry, it's ugly. Next frame, please. Alternative products, kitty litter, alternative chlorides, birdseed, coarse sand. Again, these are all part of the toolbox. I fully acknowledge that you can't use a lot of these alternative products on highways, but you can use them on city sidewalks, residential driveways. They are good alternatives. The alternative chlorides, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, they do cause less damage. And so for a lot of people, they're considered safe. So safe that they don't even think about following manufactured recommendations. Oh my God, I can mulch with this stuff. It's safe because it doesn't have sodium. It has chloride. So follow the directions and use it sparingly if you can. Um, Again, things like coarse sand, it can be a problem if it gets in the waterways. So sweep it up before it gets in the waterways. I'm the next frame, and this is the last frame. I'm a real believer in kitty litter. I use kitty litter and bird seed, and I'm on a corner lot, so I use it on the city sidewalks, the carriage paths, my sidewalks, my driveway. It works. And I just sweep it off in the grass. It's just clay. So it's no big deal. And if I use bird seed, which I do a lot, the birds take care of that for me. So it's kind of it's a lot better than burlap wrapped around plants. So the last frame is the last of my little presentation here. And I know it was quick. I know it was shallow. I hope it caused you to think about a couple different things. More than anything, I hope it causes you to think about what is salt doing to the soil and that living food web. So thank you very much. And I still can't see the webinar screen.
Well, we could hear you the whole time, Gary.
Oh,
So
good. Oh, good.
thank you so much. You did a great job there. So if you have any questions for Gary, you can pop them into the question box, but we're going to answer them after Phil's presentation. So let me just give Phill the power to present. So I can let Phill Sexton introduce himself, but he is from WIT Advisors, and he consults with, I think, private companies all over, and maybe some public ones too, about smart salting techniques.
We do indeed, and I'll just confirm, I think you can see my screen fine. Is that right, Emily?
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. So hi everyone, thanks for having me. And Emily and I, we were just remembering we first met in Virginia a couple of years ago, and we work a lot on projects both with municipalities and with private organizations. But just a little bit about us. There's several things that we do as a consultancy, really. We developed and managed something called the Sustainable Salt Initiative, which I'll get a little bit into later on in the presentation. We are the industry advisors for the Snow and Ice Management Association. I personally worked on their staff for a number of years, helping develop a lot of the education and curriculum for training the industry. And we develop and manage a cooperative called the WIT Collaborative of many different landscape winter management companies throughout North America. And the big thing that I'll speak with you today about is something called the Sustainable Winter Management Program, which we govern. And I'll share this though with you, that everything that I share with you today, similar to Gary, it's not enough time to sort of get real deep into any of this, but just to start to give you some awareness. But my context of knowledge in this is I have been a very large scale commercial landscape winter management contractor for over 30 years. And we are still contractors in addition to the many other businesses we're in. And so I have a very personal vested interest in the salt issues, mainly because of one very significant experience I had not that long ago, which was I'm a former partner and chief executive of the largest landscape and snow operation business in could be the world, but definitely in North America. And so what that means is in my last role in that business venture, I oversaw a national scale winter operation, snow and ice operations for over 102 locations throughout the contiguous United States. And so what that means is I was indirectly the single largest offender of what might be considered oversalt application or this pollution that a lot of what Gary was speaking about today. And so that's what sort of led me to something that is now described as the SWIM program. It's a set of guidelines that really is established more so as a business to business program or model, however, because there's lots of initiatives out there that I'll show you in a minute going on with this, but really what it boils down to is a lot of this issue is coming from sort of the private sector of the industry. And so this is why we have sort of a two-phase mission in both protecting properties and protecting our water. And that there's a goal that is really tied to this problem, which is really for us, we're trying to reduce by 2025 5 billion pounds, or what really equates to about $250 million worth of salt waste annually. So we know that if we can replicate a lot of the results that we've been able to see with properties that follow these guidelines, if we can affect 50,000 acres and 5,000 lane miles, which that sounds like a lot, but it's actually not a lot when you think about the total acreage throughout the United States, particularly where this is a bigger issue. We know we can get there quickly. And what that equates to really is we would be preventing 50 of these barges of ever entering the watershed of, call it wherever it is. But what may be interesting to know is these barges, particularly on the East Coast, I'm actually speaking with you from Rochester, New York today. I live just west of Albany, New York, but we work on this problem all over the country, and particularly if you're on the East Coast, a lot of the salt that you see being applied doesn't even come from the United States. So there are a lot of salt mines, particularly here in upstate New York. But interestingly enough, a lot of the salt that's being applied, even just on the east side of New York State, is coming from Peru, Egypt, Argentina. It's coming from somewhere else, and there's reasons for that. There's economic reasons for that. And so a lot of these barges of salt are entering our ports and eventually being transported to different depots all over the East Coast, and then being applied on our roads and our parking lots and our sidewalks, which are then entering eventually the soils, as Gary mentioned, and more so into the watershed, lakes, streams, groundwater, and it's not even salt that came from here. So isn't it interesting that we're sort of further contributing to the problem from sources outside of the United States? So that goal is really tied to this specific problem, which has really been termed as the acid rain of our time. And I share this with a lot of people. I'll date myself a little bit, but back in 1987, I was a senior in high school, and I wrote a paper on acid rain. So I'm from central New York, love the Adirondack region of New York State, and acid rain was a big problem from the coal-fired energy plants from the Midwest. That issue is now sort of resurfacing again, but now it's from road salt contamination. And we're seeing this all over the country. So as I mentioned, this is where Emily and I first met, because there's an issue with the Occoquan Reservoir system and road salt contamination entering that water body, if you will, which is people's drinking water. And it's really the most important drinking water resource in that very dense metropolitan area. They don't have another headwaters, if you will, that they can rely on once this has been polluted enough to where they need to shut it down. So they've got to fix the issue. But I've been working on this issue for at least 8 years now, and we're really starting to see these salt reduction initiatives popping up all over the country. So we work with every single one of these are mentioned in this map. And when you think about it in terms of how serious it is, I'm in New York State. Our DEC commissioner, I've literally sat at the table with them when they've said this salt contamination issue, particularly when it's related to groundwater, particularly when it's related to drinking water, it's potentially one of the #1 environmental issues going on in many different states that almost nobody knows about, which is interesting. And then for some reason, there's also reasons why it's not being dealt with appropriately. And a lot of that's tied back to, you know, even what Gary said early on. There's a liability issue, there's a public safety issue, there's a societal expectation issue that really has to be dealt with as well. And so this program, these guidelines are really meant to help drive that change and drive solutions. But anywhere we go, we're seeing this issue. Here in New York State, there's actually two bills, two sets of legislation that are in the governor's desk now to be approved. So, you know, in New York, we're sort of the state where a lot of the laws start. And so I just share with people, the legislation train or the regulation train on this issue is really sort of already left the station. And so we're very proud to be part of that solution. So, but again, anywhere I go in the country, like even we work in St. Louis now, we work with Bayer Corporation there. And I sort of ask myself, a lot of places where it doesn't snow that much, or at least you wouldn't think so, I wonder if it's a problem here really. And so sure enough, we find that this pie chart that I'm going to show you next, this is sort of the proof of this is happening anywhere road salt's being applied. And interestingly enough, like where I discussed in Virginia, a lot of the places where you would think, it doesn't snow that much, believe it or not, that's potentially where more salts are being used than, say, places like where I am in upstate New York, where we get a tremendous amount of snow. But where we get a lot of snow, we don't necessarily get a lot of the other issues that happen with winter weather, which is a lot of cases freezing rain, black ice, those kind of conditions, which you can really only deal with salts. And so what really caught my attention to this whole issue, though, is a lot of this issue for years was dealt with at a state highway DOT level. And what's really happened is what we found out is this pie chart is sort of representative of what's going on all over the country, where salt contamination or chloride contamination is a problem due to non-point source runoff of the salts from the roadways, from the parking lots. Most of this is coming from parking lots. And so that's where I got really keen on starting to understand this issue, because that meant my industry as a contractor, we were being targeted as the biggest offenders of this. And as I shared with you earlier, being the largest contractor in the private sector, that meant I somehow was mostly responsible for this compared to any other contractor in the country. So I take that seriously. I sort of call this my penance, but there's other ways that we see that this is a problem. So we see it in the infrastructure, we see it at the grocery store, we see this over application of salt being conducted everywhere. Gary showed you a lot of these pictures. I've got probably thousands of them, Gary, if you want more of them. But keep in mind, I started in this industry as a horticulturist. I'm actually a tree lover before anything else. I've worked as a consulting arborist for years, and so I appreciate where Gary's coming from this. And so I've also done a lot of homework on this. My Harvard thesis, a lot of research that we did on this is related to a sustainability analysis, the commercial winter management industry's use of salt. And so this program, these guidelines really deal with not only sort of salt application at the application level, but what are all the primary drivers and variables that are causing salt to be used at the amount and the frequency that it is today. And so I will tell you, at a broad level, a lot of what's happened is, I grew up in central New York, part of the snow belt. And, back in that same time when I wrote that paper back in the 80s, the expectation also was that white hard pack roads for several months out of the year, probably like you, Gary, in Minnesota, that was an expectation. People just expected that's generally what the road conditions would be like. And what did we do about it? We drove differently. We had the proper tires on our cars. We had the proper footwear, and that's just what we did. And then just like everything else, our expectations change. You know, sometime in the late 1950s, New Hampshire was the first state in the union to use road salt to start dealing with this issue. Back in the 1980s in New York, we had the Lake Placid Olympics, and so the New York DOT had to figure out a way to get people up into the Adirondacks safely for that very large event. And lo and behold, that's when the expectation changed. And then that expectation is just trickled down to the sidewalks, has trickled down to your driveway, just like lots of other things do. Turf care is the same way. I always use sports turf as the other analogy of, you know, as sports turf industry started to really increase their level of quality, so did everyone else, to the golf courses, to the soccer fields, to your backyard. And so that's what happened. So one of the big things that this thesis research really pointed out to me, though, was, you know, when you're doing this kind of research, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of it, but you sort of come up with your primary hypothesis of why this problem is occurring. So I dealt with that problem again, that chloride contamination was on the rise rapidly due to road salt use. So why is this happening? And the number one driver I hypothesized at the time was it must be liability, slip and fall liability, car accidents, a lot of things that, you know, people breaking hips, a lot of things that Gary talked about earlier. Lo and behold, what this part of the process really figured out, though, was it really wasn't the number one driver. It wasn't even the number two driver. It actually ended up being the number 5 driver, because even if you took all the liability away, there's a couple of primary things that happen anyway. So like in say, call it a commercial setting that you may all be familiar with. I'm Walmart and you're Target. What happens is one of those two stores or both of those stores want to be open for business and want to look better than their competitors as quickly as possible. And so that's one of the reasons why salt gets used the way it does, like in this picture. This picture actually was taken at a headquarters of one of our clients right here in Rochester, where I sit today. And even this client admitted that quality of service, as our level of expectation increases, so does our expectation for quality, let's say. And so once you get to the point of a black, wet driveway or parking lot or roadway, what's the next thing you can achieve? It's like, well, how about some more salt? Let's just make sure it stays that way. And then suddenly in the last, say, 5 to 10 years, the expectation of white hard pack roads has changed to white roads again, white driveways, but now we want it white with salt. And so even if you take that liability away, I won't bore you with all the research that I did for 2.5 years, but it really told us that people's expectations for this is what they expect now. And so they're going to want to have something better. I'm going to tell you what better is in a minute, but the other driver is simply this. Particularly in the private sector, there's contracts. So there's snow and ice removal contracts or clearing contracts. And 75% of those contracts generally do not incentivize for efficient salt use, because salt is being sold and purchased by the amount, by the application, by the frequency. And so there's a lot of, you buy it by the ton, you buy it by the bag, you apply it by the ton, you apply it by the bag. And so if that's how I'm being paid as a contractor, why in the world would I want to do less of that? Why in the world would I want to be more efficient? And so that sort of drives us to this broad set of guidelines that they look like this, but I don't want to overwhelm you with this, but this is how we certify properties. But it really, when you really boil it down, it's something I like to call sort of innovation 360. So SWIM as a set of policy guidelines really is meant to be a continuous improvement model, a 360-degree model where you start with measuring, but it's based on measuring, performance-based contracts, technology we actually use that I'll share with you a bit about for monitoring sites, tracking salt output, preventing the bond of snow and ice through a method called anti-icing, and then the use of optimization technology. And what we're able to do is sort of hold, kind of like the LEED, if you're familiar with LEED through the U.S. Green Building Council, but just like green buildings have to be held accountable for doing things a certain way, we hold properties accountable in a similar way. So it's not meant to be designed the same way, but it is similar in that it is an accountability model. The difference here is we are really able to show people and properties and property owners ways to save money. So, you know, on sort of the extreme sides, we're saving sometimes double the cost. We're sometimes saving, you know, 3 times the amount of salt that was being applied. This set of guidelines in this program has been independently studied through several different means, including here Rochester Institute of Technology, through their New York Pollution Prevention Institute. You know, they studied this, and not only were they able to verify that following these guidelines helped to reduce the frequency of salting by up to 50%, but that in turn is also creating some other benefits related to greenhouse gas emissions, energy demand, just because if we're driving trucks around, let's say, that much less, there's another sort of unintended but very beneficial consequence to that, which is we're just driving less, using less fuel, less emissions. So I'll quickly get into some of these guidelines, but when it comes to measuring accountability, where we start is you have to measure your salt output. There are very inexpensive ways now to do that through GPS-enabled salt tracking. What's very interesting though is this, is when you look at the manufacturing side of this equation, the folks that make the salt spreaders, we're getting to the point now where, you know, if I told you you have to follow a speed limit, but you have to do it in a car or a vehicle that does not have a speedometer, how would you handle that? And so that's what's happening in this case as well. There's salt spreaders that are made, but they don't actually have any kind of odometer on it. So there's no way for the industry to genuinely, I should say, measure their output. So a lot of it's guessing. When it comes to anti-icing or preventing the bond, it's very similar to what you do with a stick frying pan. So in this case, the use of salt before a storm, and what I encourage is you actually use brine to do that. So brine is the liquid form or the end result of, you know, that rock salt, that solid material that then actually has to convert to a brine before it actually is able to lower the freeze point of water on the surface. That's scientifically what's happening. That's the reaction that you need as an end result. And so think about it, if you sprinkle it on your own driveway or sidewalk, how long does it take before you see that it's converted to that brine? Did you know that it's that brine is what actually is creating that quote unquote melting process? It's gotten a lot less expensive as far as how you apply this brine. This brine is also helping with those pictures I showed you earlier, tracking into the buildings. That's a lot of what we try to appeal to building owners and property owners, is there's a problem even beyond the parking lot and the sidewalks, which is what this corrosion and what this abrasive effect of rock salt in particular is causing in their buildings. So this is like 100 grit sandpaper that when we work with a company here called Wegmans, a grocery market chain that some of you may have heard of, they literally spend $250,000 a year replacing doorways because of the use of this salt. So that's why we come with these chloride-free liquid all or brine alternatives to help them with that solution. So with that then is analysis and improvement of your salt application. You can do that through this monitoring technology, which again is very inexpensive for the private sector to now be able to analyze their own fleets of trucks to see who's putting down, say, double the amount versus half the amount, but achieving the same level of service. And so how do we enable them to do that more so? And then the optimization part of the process really is there's technology and methodologies in particular that allow you to more efficiently apply salt through direct liquid applications, through pre-wetting technologies, which I wish we had more time to get into the technicality how that works today, but then there's also plow technology that's improved that's allowing you to remove as much of the accumulated snow on a surface and prevent the bond, so that it requires, you know, literally 3 times less the amount of salt that you would need when you need to break the bond. So when you boil it all down, really what it comes down to is SWIM is both a set of guidelines and a method of accountability that we use on properties. The results for us have been at a municipal level. We have been achieving, through the use of these guidelines consistently for a number of years now, you know, no less than 30% reduction in salt. We're seeing upwards of 50% and greater in salt reduction in this little town of Hague in the Lake George region. You know, they've got a $150,000 a year budget that they have to work with, and they saved $60,000 last year through following these guidelines. So they're actually now reinvesting half of those savings into the optimization technology side of what we're discussing. They've actually invested in a brine making plant that they can now make their own brine even more efficiently instead of buying it. So again, that's really what's sort of feeding the continuous improvement process, you know, that circle of guidelines that I showed you earlier on. From a private side, the Wegmans that I discussed with you, I mean, what it's enabled them is predictable and repeatable costs now. You know, but they're really now bought into the idea of the reduced impact both to the natural environment and then also to their environment, to their infrastructure. So a lot of that $250,000 that they have to budget a year for replacing doorways, they're starting to see a reduction in that. And what it really means to them, that's why I say a lot of this really boils down to, because most of this problem is actually coming from the private sector, from the private parking lots and the private roadways. That's why a business to business model, I believe, and we believe, is beneficial, because it's really, you know, sustainability, if you think about it, it's 2 sides of the same coin. It's both environmental and economic, and we're really actually speaking to the economics of this first. You know, when you look at, in the case of a retailer, they like to look at what's it cost per parking space. We're saving them on average $14 a year, which when you scale that chain wide, that's over $1.5 million a year for them. When we started piloting this, it was already saving them $500,000. They pay attention to that. And then that's why salt reduction becomes more important. This is really their list. These are their slides that they share with us, that they communicate internally to them. And externally, really what it's boiled down to is we've helped them to already save over 1 billion gallons of water from being contaminated from their own parking lots. And you can actually sort of convert salt reduction to you know, a CO2 equivalent of, in this case, just through our pilot program so far, it's the equivalent of taking over 1,500 cars off the road and you know, the energy use of over 800 homes. And so to be able to take salt and then convert it into this kind of equation is really where the guidelines are creating these results now, that, you know, we actually need help scaling this to, you know, that 50,000 acres and that 5,000 lane miles. And so again, similar to what Gary said, you know, I wish I could go a lot deeper with this. We'd need a lot more time with that. But that said, this conversation doesn't need to end here. If any of you are interested to learn more, I'm always happy to, you know, no strings attached, just have conversations with folks about how we work on this collaboratively. And so please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. So now we have some time for questions. So you guys should see a question panel. Feel free to stick your question in there. I can ask Phil or Gary. Gary, you still there?
I am still here. My screen is still blank.
Well, you've done a great job of holding on. My first question is for you, Gary. It's just, we understand how, from your presentation, how salt affects trees and soil from the road directly, but if salt is in the water table or a stream, how does it affect vegetation using that water or near that water body?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Okay, glad we
I
could
mean,
ask it.
if you look in drainage ditches where the runoff water goes and chloride builds up, in particular chloride, but also sodium too, that's when you will see root death and then tree death, plant death, shrub death, grass death, everything. So why would that? I suppose with groundwater, there's a certain amount of filtration that goes on. One of the situations we have in Minneapolis is they've used suspended pavement. And by the time you get down to where the water finishes going through the soil and then the 18 inches of sand below the soil, so it's a total depth of, in some areas, almost 9 feet. By the time the water gets through that, percolates through that into the groundwater, it's pretty darn clean. So, you know, it has filtered out the salts from that point of view. But, you know, that's taken a very specific situation, and I would be afraid to apply that generally to anything. So I would go back to my first answer is like, I don't really know.
Okay. Well, thank you. I still think that was a pretty good answer. I guess this question is probably more for Phill, from Kelly. I've gotten pushback that brine is more destructive to cars than rock salt. Is there any truth to this?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, from my experience, zero truth to that. It's really a misnomer, because what people need to understand is if rock salt, let's say, was being used on that highway system before, you've always been using brine, and if anything, you're using more of it with that rock salt because there's just more material going down. So that solid rock salt does nothing till it converts to brine.
Mm-hmm.
It's the brine is what actually is the end result that the highways and the contractors need. And so that's the wet on the road. That's the brine. The only reason why it may be causing a slightly different issue is if they're, and this happens a lot, but sometimes they're blended with another product to help it stick to the road, which then there is this debate, is that also making it stick to the car more? So that's a debate, but usually what they're blending it with is something that's non-corrosive. And so a lot of times, like if you have this in the back of your vehicle, it's actually helping to stop the rusting of vehicles. That's why I think it's misunderstood at this point. Good question.
Thank you. And then another question about brine. Can you point to references that demonstrate that brine is less harmful to water quality? Does brine pose environmental problems?
It certainly does. So I mean, if you were just to dump this brine right into, you know, a water body, absolutely. But here's the thing, brine is salt water. So it's 23.3% concentrate, call it rock salt to water. So here's what happens when you just spread a bunch of rock salt on the road. We know through a lot of research, at least, and I stress at least 20% of that salt that you spread on the road or the parking lot or sidewalk never does anything except there's bounce and scatter, and it just gets scattered somewhere else into the soils. And so it was just waste, versus at least now you're taking a concentrated form of this, putting it directly on the surface where you want it. It creates a residue effect, but it is in general like using 70% less, plus or minus, in the liquid form versus in the solid form. You've got all that waste before you even get started. So in general, once we get operations going or using primarily liquid or brine as the method, they're reducing the amount of actual rock salt that they used to use by about 70%.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think this is a really great question from Dave, given, and this for both Gary and Phill, given the need to change public expectations, what have you found to be the most influential things that you've said to change public attitudes, understanding regarding salt?
You want to go first, Gary?
You're asking for general things. For property owners, the loss of their plants, especially their beloved shade trees or turf grass or anything that they have to keep replacing or can't replace anymore. For people that live in apartment buildings, they could care less about that. It's the condition of their vehicles, and probably if they were a little bit more environmentally aware, they're very concerned about water quality. So I think when we speak, that's what we have to do, is instead of speaking from our own personal opinions, we have to look at all the potential target audience, how it potentially could affect them, and bring that into the conversation. So you lose your trees, you lose your grass. Foresters could care less about turf grass dying, to be honest with you. And people that love playing golf could care less about trees dying, to be honest with you. And the tough thing is figuring out which your target audience is actually going to listen to. And sometimes it's money. Phil's done a really good job of talking money. That's a pretty good message.
Yeah, I would just add to that then. I think Gary's right. I mean, I sort of say it this way. I mean, I'm both an environmentalist and a capitalist. And so those two usually don't blend, but in some ways we need them to blend, because I sort of say it this way: much as I love the environment, the brutal reality is almost everyone has some level of respect for the environment, but generally not that much compared to all the other things that people are worrying about or prioritize or have to focus on. And so we got to make it real easy. And that is why it took me a while to learn that even though our core mission is really very much just an environmental mission, but we had to make the business case for it. And so that's what we've done with these guidelines is we've helped. Wegmans is a great example. When they came to us for help, it had nothing to do with the environment at all. It had everything to do with money. It had everything to do with their budgets. They in turn then, once you start to show whoever the broad category of stakeholders are what's in it for them, then they'll pay attention to the environmental side of the coin. But even with the municipalities, these folks we work with in Lake George, they love the lake, but they also need a job. They get yelled at when the roads aren't perfect. And so we don't necessarily even stress don't use salt. We're just trying to say this is a conservation effort. And so this is one of these environmental issues that I think, compared to most others, actually doesn't need to cost more money. You can actually save money and you don't necessarily have to sacrifice the level of service either, but it takes awareness first, some level of pain to get them to want to change, or at least show them what their pain is. And then, we got to give them the answer. There's got to be answers too. Unfortunately, there has to be an easy button for this. And so, that's what we still struggle through a little bit, is making this really easy.
Thank you. And then a question that relates to that for Lake George: was there public outreach done in Lake George to prepare the community for those changes, if you know, Gary?
Oh, you mean Phil? Yeah, that's our project.
Sorry,
Yeah, there is. But I think, again, it goes back to, we're sort of the change agents, but what it's required is very broad stakeholder engagement. So, we've got a funding mechanism for this because it's not in anybody's budget. So we work with a nonprofit or an NGO for that. working with the politicians. There's a memorandum of understanding that was sort of put into play at a political level. And then we work at a very practical level with the municipalities first. So we got the sort of the public side of this working on this first. And that was no easy task to get operators that have been doing it the same way for 10, 20, 30 years to think about doing things differently. And then we moved on to the private side of the industry, you know, because you can't blame it's just like I showed you in that pie chart. The roads actually are not the biggest part of the issue here. You think about 1 lane mile of road that puts down somewhere between 100 and 400 pounds of salt. There's acres and acres of parking lot on either sides of that lane mile, depending on where you live, you know, particularly in a commercial district. So it makes sense it's coming from parking lots, but the private side wants the public side to take responsibility first. So that's part of what we did. So I'd be happy to share more with that. There's a pretty big story behind that, but that's sort of how we got started.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we got a lot of questions, but if you want to contact Gary or Phill with your questions, you can, I mean, they provided their email, but you can email me at saltwatch@iwla.org and I can forward you their contact information. The last question's from Jackie, and it's about Brine again. Her public works department says that their salt spreaders aren't equipped to apply brine. How expensive is it to retrofit trucks with brine application devices? Like, what does it cost a municipality?
That's a big it depends question. What the truck is, the size, the lane miles they have to cover. So, you know, it's anywhere from $2,500 to $25,000. So it really depends on the situation. So I know that's really broad, but that we'd have to drill down on what exactly it is they're dealing with. But I will say this, but it can be done and it is affordable if they're willing to make the change. They're, you know, it pays for itself, I guess is the point.
Right. Yeah, because the cost of other things go down. It's just an investment.
Yep.
Okay. Well, Phill and Gary, thank you both so much for your time. We went a little bit over time, but we got a lot of questions. And I hope that this sparked some interest from our participants, and they're going to think about changes they can make this winter, both personally and in their community. So thanks, everybody. And
you're welcome.
Thank you so much. And like I said before, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care, all.
Bye.
Have a safe winter.
Ditto.